Hi folks, Ryan Honeyman here from Lift Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy MBA to help address this and similar questions. Lift Economy's Next Economy MBA is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational next economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lifteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Vincent Medina and Louis Trevino, welcome to Next Economy Now.
Thank you. I'd like to start by introducing myself in the Chochenyo language, which is the language of where my family is from and where I live in the East Bay. And our language, it's something that we're very proud of, and we're happy that it can be spoken even in these contemporary times. So Horshetuhi Makam Kanakrakat Vincent Medina, Aye Kanakalkin Saklan Taresh, Nesa Kanakrote Halkin, Hoshe Warep, Mani Maksuyak Mayahiswi, Uyaki Shnetuhi Hushish Tak Aye, Aye Kanak Ukshere Mak Amham Tak Maknan Rakat Louis Trevino, Kakuntush Taresh. So hello, my name is Vincent Medina, and I'm a member of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe, and we're East Bay people. So what I mean by that is our people have always lived here in the East Bay. From those ancient times to where we're at today, no generation has ever moved away from there, so it's our home. And I said in that introduction that I'm joined by my partner, Louis Trevino, who's Rumsen Ohlone, and together we run Makamham, which means our food in Chochenyo language, an organization focused on reviving and strengthening our traditional Oloni foods and sharing those back with our families. And also we run Cafe Ohlone, which is the very first Oloni restaurant in modern times over in Berkeley. And I'll let Louis introduce himself as well.
Inkatomakam Karak Louis Trevino Kaitmai Kakonta Huya Ichilat Chuknut Chait Shokronta Ime Achistaru Kakan Kakonta Huya. Hello everyone, my name is Louis Trevino, and as Vince was saying, we do this work together to revitalize our traditional Oloni foods for our family, so that our families can be reconnected with them. These are our oldest foods that we prepare for our family. We also share them with the public so that people can learn about our people, so that they can respect us in a richer way.
Thank you both so much. I am so grateful that I recently had the honor of going to Makamham, and I wanted to bring our listeners in a bit to the experience, and maybe you could share kind of what the experience looks like to come to the cafe, and maybe a little bit about what Indigenous protocol means and how you start and why it's relevant for all of us, whether we're California native or not.
Absolutely. So in terms of what the cafe looks like, first, before I talk about that, I'd like to just share a little bit of context about why it's so important to have this cafe in the first place for our community, and then that better helps shape why we do this work, and also helps give that information about why this is so important as well to our family as also. And both Louis and myself haven't been able to see many reminders of our culture that are out there in the public, beyond seeing our culture reflected in our homes. And as I shared in that introduction, where I was raised and where I live today with Louis, it's in this area that my family has always lived. And I mean that literally. Like, everybody's lived here from those ancient times to where we're at today. And because we've been here for so long, there's this connection that's so deep, words can never fully express it. But there was also a lot of sacrifices that our people made in order that we could still be here today and still live here. And where we live and where our community is based, it's in a very specific area along San Leandro and San Francisco Creeks. And that's also oldest tribal area as well. So my great grandmother was born in the same area that I was born in, and where I was raised, and where I live at today. And because of that, there's these connections that are overlapped, contemporary and ancient experiences that all are they form our identity, and also help really shape that connection to this place. However, because colonization hit us so hard and so fast in this area, and it only came 240 years ago, not that long ago, because of that, there was this active suppression of our traditional culture. And because this area also was urbanized very quickly, there aren't a lot of tangible reminders that are around that our people still, at least growing up, that's how it was. And that can be very isolating. You might imagine when you're in your place where every member of your family has always lived, but when you walk on the streets, even though you're right in your home, you don't see a lot of reminders that you exist anywhere. You don't see our aesthetics, our art, you don't see our roundhouses, those traditional religious structures. You don't hear people speaking Chochenyo on the streets very often. And you don't see, in the past, there wasn't any of our food that was reflected in restaurants. And that could be very isolating, especially when you're from a place, and it can weigh heavy as well to not see those things reflected. And growing up in the Bay Area, there's a huge food culture that's here, and I would always go with my friends to their families' restaurants to try their heritage foods. And there was always something that was so powerful about that, to be able to eat those foods and also learn about their culture in the process. You learn about who they are, about where they come from. You respect their culture in a different way. And there's also like this insider knowledge that my friends would have with the people who were running those restaurants, and people would be treated, and really respectfully, and people would share language about the foods that they were going to eat and how delicious they were. And then, somebody from outside of those cultures got to try it as well and experience that too. And I always wish that we had something like that. And I know Louis did too, and many others in our family. Just wish that we could be able to see our culture reflected in prominent ways outside of our homes. But again, all of this is tied into our history. And when we learn about why these things weren't reflected outside of our homes, it can be very sad, because that our history is directly related to why these things why those things aren't being reflected in visible ways until things started to change recently. And our foods were suppressed very heavily by both the Spanish and the Mexican periods, and later the American government, which is only barely starting to change now. And we wanted to create a space where Ohlone people could be able to see our foods reflected, but also our culture reflected in this really proud and unabashed way. And so we dreamed up having Cafe Ohlone, and what it turned out to be is just like, we think of it as like a love poem to Oloni culture, because when people walk in, you see our culture reflected in very proud ways, and it's undeniable that they're entering an Oloni space. Like when you walk in, one of the first things that people see, and might I add that when people walk in, they're in the chaos of downtown Berkeley, right across from the university on Bancroft. So Sattergate and the student union is literally right across the street from us. But also there's the Berkeley Hills that are also visible from the street when you are about to enter into the cafe. And just on the other ridge of those hills is where a lot of our family's old villages are at also. And we think about those things, and we think about being in the homeland as we're working to revive our food traditions and have our foods be visible again. We think about that these foods are the foods of that space. They've always been eaten there, and just for a few generations they haven't been, and that makes us feel sad when we think about the reasons why, but we also know that there's ways to remedy that as well, and then that makes us feel hopeful. So you walk in through this old bookstore, University Press books, and through these narrow corridors full of just these old books, which are very personally significant for me because my grandmother, she used to work at UC Berkeley's library as a bookbinder, and she would always come home when I was a child with all these beautiful books, and that's always been something that's been comforting to her. So when my grandmother comes there, it's also a familiar space. It's something that she's very comfortable with. But you walk through these bookshelves that are just full of books, through these narrow passages until you reach this back space, which is outdoors. And you go through a glass door, and there's this narrow back patio that's there that is attached to the kitchen at Musical Offering Cafe, which we also use as well. And when you go into that back space, it's a celebration of our culture. You see our traditional basketry aesthetics that are painted on the walls as a mural with abalone adornments hanging down, which represents our Oloni feathered baskets, some of our finest cultural objects that our people would make into these beautiful baskets that are pieces of art, that are these intricate baskets that take years to make. And we put an old Oloni basket design with those abalone pendants hanging with clamshell beads, so that the first thing people see is what our traditional aesthetics look like. There's baskets and the raw ingredients, and there's our traditional games like walnut dice and staves and the bone pieces made from deer bone that we used to play hand games. There's the raw salt that we gather from San Francisco Bay, from the East Bay shoreline, with the digging sticks made from manzanita that are burned down, that we use as we're digging for bulbs or as we're digging for the salt during summertime months. So the menus on the border in Churchill, so people see our language reflected, and they get to see our language represented with a lot of pride. Also throughout the space, there's a huge redwood table, 12-foot long redwood table that comes from a fallen East Bay redwood from the Oakland Hills, not far from where our family's old villages also are at in those old days before colonization, which also might add is very close to where our contemporary community still lives today as well. And that fallen East Bay redwood table, it's we think about our family a lot as we dine around it, as we sit around there, and it's the beautiful centerpiece. There's blankets that are placed on every chair, which are these really colorful blankets, sorapes, which were purchased by my mom, and she brought those over to bring a lot of comfort into the space, and it brings a lot of color, but also they're functional. So we want people to wrap themselves in those as they're cold. Also in the space, we sprinkle flower petals and have vases of the flowers that are blooming right now on the table, and also on the place settings, which represent this time that we're in right now, of this flowering, of early springtime, of abundance that we're seeing. there's a big chalk painting that's on the back which says Oloni land, reminding people that we've never given up on this place, we've never left this place, that we've never ceded this place to anybody else, that this is our home. And what we're seeing right now is a revival of these practices that were always meant to be practiced in this place where they were intended since the time to where we're at today. And when people walk in, also there's abalone that's on the tables with candles and acorns and hazelnuts and buckeyes, all of these beautiful ingredients that we gather from those old areas that again reflect who we are and where we come from. So it's a celebration of our culture. And so because of that, we want this to be much more than just something that's physical, but we also want people, through our words, want people to know beyond the aesthetics of the space, because it is an Indigenous space, it is an Ohlone space, that things aren't going to look exactly like a standard restaurant might look. Things are going to be slower, and also things are going to be focused on culture very heavily. And in our culture, there are protocols that we have and things that are proper when we have a meal, such as we always set a plate aside for our ancestors. And that's something that culturally is very important for us, because we know that our ancestors are the ones who allow us to be able to have these food traditions still, to be able to carry these things on and be able to revive them. They left us with the knowledge to do these things, and it's only because of those people that we can have them. So it's, in our way, it's always the proper thing to have a plate aside of all the foods that we're going to eat for any meal, whether it's a small tea hour or whether it's a large formal dinner that we do on Saturday nights. And we set aside all those foods and the teas that we'll serve, and then we always give an introduction to the context of why we're doing this work, so that we introduce our community to the diners, so that they know who we are, they know why we're doing this, and they know that our community is here and strong and we're not going anywhere also. After that, we share a prayer to what those foods represent, a prayer in Chochenyo, and then Louis will share a prayer in Rumsen, and sometimes we'll translate it, sometimes not, but it's in order to remind people that these foods, that they're connected to something far bigger than we can ever express. And by giving gratitude, we believe that we're recognizing the spirituality of these foods, but also, like I said before, giving gratitude to our Creator and also to our ancestors who allow these foods to be in our lives still. After we have the prayer, then we always ask for elders to be served first. And if there's an elder that's hard for them to get up, we don't want to make their life any hard. We want to be able to make them feel good, and we'll bring the food over to them, their teas over to them, and all the elders who are there always get served first. And then after that, everybody else gets to eat as well. It's important for us to do these things because it connects the food to our values, and we don't want to commodify this food so that it becomes something that is just like the next trend or something like that. But instead, we want to be uncompromising about our values, so that every aspect of the food, whether it be through gathering the food with prayer, or whether it be through the preparation of the food, where we try to only have good thoughts and good intentions as we're cooking, to the serving of the food, and even afterwards, to the burning of the plates after the meal. We always want these things to be followed to the best that we can. And that's something that's significant to us. It means a lot to us, and it also is something that we're, like I shared, we're not willing to compromise on, because those are values that are embedded in our identity and in our culture, and things that we take extremely seriously. With all of this, at the end of the meal, we always have a call to action. And what that is reminding people that now they're our allies. If they come to the cafe, if they're experiencing this food, we also ask them to share these messages far and wide, so that they leave the table and go into the streets around us. And what we say by that is to stand up for our community. If there's harmful misconceptions that they hear out there, one of the really harmful misconceptions that exists but still prevalent is that Ohlone people don't exist anymore. That's just, obviously, it's not true. There's no point in even acknowledging, such a stupid statement, but we still have to combat that regularly. And that's so frustrating when you constantly have to remind people that your people exist and when we're standing right there. So we ask people to refute whenever they hear those misconceptions. If they ever hear our culture talked about in past tense, that people will correct that and say that our culture is living, that these things are to be spoken about in present tense. If people say that our food was eaten, our language was spoken, or that these things once mattered, that people stand up and say that these things do matter, that our language is spoken, that these foods are eaten, and that they will continue to be in the future as well. The other thing is we feel that when people from outside of our community know that there's a strong, viable, and visible Oloni community that exists, then people are more inclined to respect our people and stand with us than if they think the latter. So that means when we're working to protect our shell mounds or reaffirm our federal recognition, repatriate our ancestors, when we're working to be able to protect our waterways, protect the bay, all these things that are significant to us that matter a great deal. If people know that there's an Oloni community that's around that cares about these things and wants to see these things, protected or strengthened or whatever it is we're asking for, allies are more likely to stand with us if they know that we're around than if we're not. And it's important that we share that at the very end so that people know that we also ask them as well to stand with our community and to stand against that misinformation that's out there also.
Thank you so much for taking the time to bring our listeners into that experience. And you've already shared so many instances of how that experience and the work you're doing, all that it can teach all of us about caring for our home, especially in the modern day. But I wonder if you or Louis would like to elaborate some more about those teachings and share any insights with our listeners.
In terms of what teaching specifically?
Specifically in terms of honoring the protocol you mentioned around prayer, honoring, sometimes it's called traditional ecological knowledge, sometimes indigenous wisdom.
So I'm sorry, I'm just having a little bit of a hard time understanding. So did you want me to go deeper into one of these topics or explain a little bit more about what we're doing with each one of these different protocols that we were talking about?
Yeah, I think what is alive for you right now and what I think I'm trying to get across for our listeners is maybe here's a better question. I hear you say you're not trying to you are rejecting the commodification of these foods, and that to me feels extremely relevant given that we do live in a world where cultural appropriation is real, and maybe does that make sense to talk a little bit about some of the tensions there and how maybe doing the work of deep listening and allyship and solidarity work, kind of walking beside and with Indigenous peoples is maybe an antidote to some of the risk of that we see so present in our economy?
Yeah. Well, one thing about commodification specifically that we, I'd like to share and is about the respect that we have for these foods won't allow commodification of these foods to happen. And because we're focused on a lot of things at once, like the cafe and what we're doing, it's really the public face of a lot of the quiet work that we're doing with our people to keep these food traditions strong. And because of that, it allows us to only be there a few days a week. And it's been something that we've crafted intentionally as well, because right now we couldn't be open 7 days a week or 6 days a week because these ingredients aren't easy to come by either. There's so many of these ingredients we gather ourselves from the direct areas that our ancestors have also gathered these foods. And because of that, always keeping indigenous way of doing this alive, an Oloni way of doing this alive is essential to us. So it means giving gratitude when we go and gather, acorn, or when we go and gather the teas that we're going to gather, giving gratitude to those teas and praying over them. We say our food is full of prayer because it is. And when we pray over these foods, it also reminds us as well, because in our way, it's important to acknowledge the plant, to acknowledge it by its proper name in our language, but also to describe our relationship to that place before we gather. So if an example of this that I can share is if I'm gathering, let's say, yerba buena, which is a native tea that grows up, and it's a mint that's a native mint that we use to make tea. Also used to wrap in our food and smoke meats and all kinds of delicious things. But if I'm going to go and gather the yerba buena, I'd want to address it in its proper name in Chochenyo, charishmin. After that, by giving some kind of a relationship to how I fit into that place, and always reminding ourselves about those deep connections that we have that go so far back that we can't even count because it's so deep. But when we give gratitude to the plant, when we say those prayers for the foods that we're about to gather, it reinforces with ourselves that we come from there, that we come from that place. And when you come from a place and you're in your home, you're only going to want to treat it with the most respect as possible. You're not going to want to go in your home and, just throw stuff around and make a mess or anything like that. Or at least I hope people wouldn't want to do that, but you want to treat it with respect and also make sure that everything's in order. And so when we gather these foods, because we are gathering them in those old village sites, we only want to gather what we need. We could always go up and gather more, but I mean, if we are only gathering for the meal that we're about to make, that's always enough for us because the land has always provided everything that we have ever needed. And it still does, even with all the city around us, it still provides for us. It's just constantly providing what we need. And that means that we also have to be good to the land as well. So there needs to be enough yerba buena for the seeds to be able to go back into the earth, for the yerba buena to be able to blossom and flower, and for it to be able to replenish itself again. If we just go and do this clear cutting of it, it won't be able to do that. It won't be able to have that ability to keep replenishing itself in abundance. And in the old days, our ancestors would do this thing with controlled burns, where people would manage certain areas and burn the overgrowth of plants, but also open up meadows and allow this huge diversity of plants to be able to reflower and reseed in abundance. And then that would create, huge amounts of these plants that our people cultivated and have always gathered. Today, we can't do those controlled burns anymore because of legal restrictions that are there in place. And that also has really, bad effects to the environment as well without having those burns. Like an example is a lot of the really catastrophic wildfires that are happening nowadays as a result of climate change. A lot of that also has to do with a lot of overgrowth that's there, and that overgrowth needing to be cleared away, which our ancestors have always done. When the Europeans came in, they said that the Bay Area looked like it was a garden, and that wasn't just a miracle just on its own, but that was cultivated by thousands of years, for thousands of years, by the hands of our direct ancestors, making it have that abundance that we still see today. Even without those burns, there's still abundance that's there. But always giving gratitude and reminding ourselves why we're gathering and reminding ourselves of the relationship to those places is very important. One of the other things that we see is we can't always gather the fruits that we want to gather nowadays. Like an example is right now in early springtime, there's these Indian potatoes that are growing called Brodea potatoes. And they only grow for a short time, the flower at least, where you can identify them. And then you have to dig for them with the digging sticks. But in the old days, our people, again, would cultivate those areas. They would grow in abundance, and people would have, Brodea potatoes for days back then, Today, we can't do that the same way because on a lucky day, we get 5 of those little tiny potatoes at the most. And yes, if we really were, irresponsible, which we're not, there are more Brodea potatoes that are there, but that would mean that there would be no harvest next year. And in some of those areas, if you clear cut them, possibly ever again. And why would somebody do that when those Brodeas also have a right to exist, just like everybody else does too. They're native as well, and they have a right to be there. So when we think about these things, we always have to be responsible, and sometimes that means creating alternatives. So we'll gather 5 Brodea potatoes and savor those 5 potatoes and allow the other potatoes that are there to be able to stay in the ground and replenish themselves. But one thing that we have found is if we want to create alternatives, sometimes we have to do that in order to have those same tastes during a certain season. Like for an example, right now in spring, those potatoes are a typical flavor that our people would have. Now we can't get those Brodea potatoes, so we started doing some research on similar potatoes that have a similar taste. And there's this heirloom potato called a Russian banana fingerling potato that has a very similar consistency and a very similar taste to those Brodeas. Very small, it's not huge, and it is very delicious, very rich and nutty and sweet. And we roast those with duck fat and bay laurel, and we serve those at the cafe and to our family. And that's a way to still have that springtime flavor without going and harming the plants that are there. And we always, just like I said, just always want to be responsible because it's our home. It's our only home. And, we're thinking of the big picture here. And that's thinking about one day when these plants will again be able to grow in abundance with proper nurturement, and also being able to nurture them properly, and also being able to show them that respect that they deserve. One of the things that can be very frustrating is there's like this big foraging movement that's out there, which is a lot of people going out mushroom hunting or going out looking for food from, and they call it foraging. And in our way, both in our language, but also how we refer to it in English as well, is we say that we're gathering because we have a relationship to the place. So we're gathering the food that our ancestors have also gathered. Forage can sometimes have connotations that make us feel uncomfortable, like bears might forage for berries or something like that. And there's just some connotations that are there that we stay away from, just because it's also not the way that our people described it in the old days. But we see this modern day foraging movement that's happening, and that can often cause a lot of tension, because when people are going into those areas where our family has always lived, and let's say they're going and they're gathering mushrooms or chanterelles, or they're going up and gathering nettles or something like that, what happens when people are going up there without that context is people often don't think about the proper ways to gather. And when there's limited resources that are there, and you can imagine Oloni people enjoying these foods forever, and then going to an area where our direct family has always lived, and then seeing the area clear cut and holes all over the place where there were once mushrooms, and also just disrespect that's shown not just to that one patch but all around it, also disturbing other plant life that should be able to be there without being disrupted at all. It can create really bad feelings that are there, especially knowing the context of colonization and of this really bad history of people coming into our home and just trying to take things that weren't theirs to take in the first place. And that's also, in a very simple way to put it, colonization in a modern form, especially when Native people aren't given the respect to go and gather in those areas first. So there's different sensitivities that are there. And that doesn't mean that every single person who gathers or every single person who's going out, is doing that. That's because we have friends that are not Ohlone, that are allies of our community that ask us about ways to be sensitive, and will gather and then sometimes bring stuff to us for the cafe. There's ways to be sensitive about it, but also we have to be honest that there's challenges that can arise when people don't think about Ohlone people and their gathering in our homeland, and they just think that these things are just, open to all and just free, or that even worse, that these things could be sold for just making a buck without giving any of that context about where they come from or the intention that comes behind these foods. So we want people to understand why context is so important, why being connected to a place is so important, and also to be able to know that Ohlone people, that we're still gathering these foods right in those places. And so if somebody just goes and takes as much as they could, then they're taken from our people at the same time, in places that we would go and gather the same foods that we know our people have always loved.
I appreciate that. So grateful for this wisdom you've shared with our listeners. And I think there's another piece embedded into what you shared around gathering, which is around land access, which we probably don't have time to go in, but we have had the honor of having Karina Gold on our podcast as well, and the Segorite Land Trust, and we'll remind our listeners to go back and re-listen to that as well. We always love to kind of close our conversation by asking, how can listeners support you? What do you need right now in the larger sense of Indigenous food sovereignty and honoring Indigenous lifeways and the reclamation of culture, and so if there's anything, a call to action, we would love to have you share that and make that call to our listeners.
Definitely. Well, come to Cafe Ohlone and see what we're doing at the cafe, because this really is something that is unique and special, and we love being at that space so much because it gives us an ability to be surrounded by our culture and be able to share our culture and how beautiful and how valuable our culture is as well in our own words. And that's in itself is something that that's very different than what we grew up with, because beyond our families, Oloni experiences have often been dictated from voices that aren't ours, meaning anthropologists and academics and ethnobotanists. And for the first time, we're really in a while, we're seeing Ohlone people leading all of these conversations publicly, and then seeing more and more and more Ohlone experiences come out into the public as well. And we know that this is what our people have always wanted, for some things, not everything, but for some things. And some things are meant to stay private, but it's important to be able to see these things reflected, and it shows healing in action and decolonization in action at the same time. But we ask for people to come and support us by just coming to the cafe and having a meal with us. We are open every Thursday from 1 to 3, where we do a big lunch of all these seasonal foods that we go and gather, made both in traditional and contemporary ways. Every Tuesday from 5:30 to 6:30, we have Tawawasi Tuesday, which is our tea hour, where we serve 3 to 4 different native teas that we gather at the start of the week, and also have music and small bites and games and stories. Every other Saturday, we have a big formal dinner called Mur, which means nighttime in Chochenyo. And that's a very elegant dinner of all of many courses that are some of our most traditional foods and very hard to prepare foods that we can only make in small batches, and we have leaders from our community come and share different experiences, talking political sovereignty or traditional arts or food sovereignty, a variety of subjects, and also just a very elegant, beautiful experience. And that also leads into every other alternating Sunday. We have Sunui Sundays, which is our brunch service, where we have many different contemporary Ohlone foods. And that's at 12:30 to 2:30. And we have things like acorn flour pancakes and duck egg frittatas and smoked salmon and bay laurel nut coffee infused with hazelnut milk. And we have a DJ that comes, and it's just a really fun experience of all of these foods coming out. It's very energetic, very lively, and a really beautiful way to see contemporary Ohlone culture in action. And also, the third Monday of every month, our employee and friend Alison Shiozaki runs Decolonize Meetup, which is focused on giving allies actions that they can take to work for a decolonized future here in the East Bay that includes Ohlone people central to this. And that's a free event. That's the third Monday of every month. And all of this information is online on our website, cafeohlone.com. That's CAFEOHLONE.com. And we hope to see people there. This work that we're doing, we know it's blessed and we know it's guided, and we're grateful that we can see these foods come back home again and see them back in our lives and see them only get stronger. And we know that those future generations of Ohlone people, that they won't have to work so hard to have these things back, on the dinner tables again, because they're just being passed on again naturally as the way that they were intended.
Thank you. And just one last question, because so many of our listeners travel to the Bay Area, and so certainly this will be a reminder for them to make sure to include Ohlone Cafe in their travel plans. But I also I'm thinking about our listeners that are all over the country, and just could you share a piece of advice around how they could connect with Indigenous people in their communities? Not specific so much as just the mindset or approach, because I imagine this resurgence is happening in so many other places around the U.S. Stolen territory. Maybe
yes, definitely. All throughout the United States, this is happening. We're seeing this movement that's occurring, this renaissance that's connecting many people, and it's even being nurtured further by being able to communicate quickly with one another through social media and the internet, and get resources that weren't available 30 years ago, which really help people work together and form a really beautiful methods of solidarity as well. So I would say the best thing you could do is it's easy to find out who the native people of wherever one lives is at are at, and just by Googling or Wikipediaing your hometown and seeing who the native people of that space are, and very likely they're still around doing quite well and finding ways to keep their culture alive too, all throughout these areas, all throughout the United States. There's Indian people who are still vibrant and keeping all of these cultural traditions alive. And a lot of times people need allies to stand with them. Sometimes people don't want allies to stand with them. Sometimes people want to be able to do these things, on their own too. So just giving that respect to let people make those decisions on their own, whether or not they want support. But that doesn't mean that whether or not they do that, people should acknowledge that they're on Indigenous land. Find out which tribe or tribes are in the area, the city, the town, the village that listeners are living in. And, even things like a small email signature saying that you're on unceded land, whatever tribe is native to where you're at. That goes a long way in showing respect and also acknowledgement of Indigenous sovereignty. And then going beyond that to find ways, if the communities or the tribes want people to stand with them to support them. And that's going to come in a multitude of ways. What works here in the East Bay for Oloni people isn't going to work for everybody, because our challenges and our experiences are all going to be different. We've never been one people, but we also have a lot in common as well. And being able to recognize, that colonization has impacted people all throughout the United States in very harmful ways. And healing does need to take place. It is taking place. But being mindful of that and also being sensitive to what individual communities ask for, and then going forward with the best intentions, with the best possible methods. That's ways that I believe that people could help, no matter what area that they're in.
Well, Vincent and Louis, you can correct my pronunciation, and I know there's not a word directly for thank you, but I did look up and was trying to find the Chochenyo translation for expressing my gratitude, and is it Kiss Horse Ekinan? I would love for you to.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, thank you for looking that up. It's Kiss Horse Ekinan, which means, to me, good is my heart, my voice, my breath. So thank you as well. And the short way that we say thanks is Ashitmak, which means I'm grateful, or we're grateful.
Ashitmak.
Yep.
Ashitmak. So grateful for your time today. Very, very grateful for the work you're doing to transform our world.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.